Aliyah shifted uncomfortably in the stiff, narrow hospital bed, feeling every muscle ache from her recent surgery. She tried to focus on anything other than the pain building in her shoulders, but it was no use. Each breath seemed to bring a new surge of discomfort. Despite her hesitancy, she eventually reached out and pressed the call button, the small movement igniting a sharp pain that rippled through her body. She'd pressed it a few times earlier, only to be met with clipped responses and stony stares. She didn't want to deal with the coldness again, but the pain was becoming unbearable. After what felt like an eternity, the door creaked open and Nurse Bethany entered. Her smile was tight, never reaching her eyes, as if even this minimal kindness was forced. She glanced briefly at Aliyah before shifting her gaze to the monitors and equipment, seeming more interested in the machinery than the person in front of her. "What is it now?" Bethany asked, her voice carrying a practiced professionalism tinged with impatience. Aliyah hesitated. Her request felt small, almost trivial, under Bethany's stern gaze. She wanted to pull back, to swallow her discomfort and try to manage on her own. But the pain was too intense. I just need my pillow adjusted. It's hard to breathe comfortably, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Bethany sighed, crossing her arms as she looked down at Aliyah with an edge of irritation. "You've already asked me 3 times tonight. I have other patients to attend to, you know." A flash of embarrassment heated Aliyah's cheeks. Her request had been simple, yet she suddenly felt like a burden. She swallowed, gathering the courage to press on. "If it's no trouble. I'm just in a lot of pain." Bethany rolled her eyes, her stance hardening as if calculating whether to help or simply walk out. Finally, she reached for the pillow, jerking it out from behind Aliyah's head and shoving it back with a briskness that made her wince. "There. But you'll have to start managing on your own," Bethany muttered. "Other patients need help just as much as you." Aliyah bit her lip, trying to hold back her frustration and the sting of tears. She could feel the unspoken line drawn between them. Bethany's demeanor made it clear that fewer requests meant less resistance, and any need for help would be met with resentment. She lay back, feeling more vulnerable than ever, her chest heavy as Bethany turned to leave. Just then, the door swung open again, and Dr. Aaron Mitchell entered the room. His soft, deliberate footsteps were accompanied by a faint smile that seemed to break through the heavy tension lingering in the air. His presence alone shifted the atmosphere, and for a brief moment, Aliyah felt a flicker of relief. "Good evening, Miss Johnson," Dr. Mitchell greeted, his voice warm and genuine as he approached her bedside. "Just here to check in on you." Bethany stiffened, her posture rigid, though she maintained a mask of professionalism. "I was just helping her settle in, Doctor," she replied in a voice that attempted to mimic politeness. Dr. Mitchell gave her a brief nod, his focus quickly returning to Aliyah. "Glad to hear it." His attention was now fully on her, and he spoke in a softer tone. "How's the pain? Have you been able to rest at all?" Aliyah managed a small smile, though the warmth in her face faded as her gaze shifted to Bethany, who now stood by the door, her eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "I'm managing," Aliyah replied quietly, feeling a strange sense of security under the doctor's gentle concern. Dr. Mitchell nodded, seemingly sensing the discomfort in the room. "Rest is essential," he added, casting a reassuring glance her way. "I'll make sure the staff checks in periodically." He turned back to Bethany, giving her a pointed look. "Please, keep an eye on her." Bethany's response was tight, her courteous smile more strained than ever. "Of course, Doctor." But the moment he left, the warmth vanished. Her expression hardened, the friendly mask dropping as the door clicked shut, leaving them alone in a chilling silence. Bethany leaned over, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "You might want to remember who's here all night," she murmured, a cold edge to her tone. "Doctors come and go, but I'm the one making sure you're comfortable." Aliyah's stomach tightened. The unspoken threat in Bethany's words left no room for misinterpretation. Her care seemed to depend on staying in Bethany's good graces, and any complaints would only make her suffer more. She held Bethany's gaze for a moment, determined not to flinch. But as Bethany's eyes bore into hers, Aliyah's resolve faltered, and she lowered her gaze, feeling trapped in her own hospital bed as the walls seemed to close in around her. Without another word, Bethany turned and left, the door swinging shut with a hollow, quiet click. The room fell into a silence thick with tension, the only sound the soft hum of the hospital machinery and the faint buzzing of the overhead fluorescent light. Aaliyah lay back, staring at the ceiling, the unease settling deeper into her chest, prickling at her senses and making her feel painfully aware of every passing second. Hours slipped by in the uneasy quiet, each one amplifying her discomfort. Her muscles ached from the lack of proper support, her body crying out in pain that only grew sharper with each attempt to adjust herself. She tried to ignore the increasing pressure in her bladder, hoping it would pass, but it only worsened, adding to her misery. Eventually, with no other choice, she pressed the call button again, each second stretching painfully as she waited. This time, the minutes dragged on without any response, her heart sinking as she began to wonder if Bethany was ignoring her on purpose. Just as the loneliness began to press in, the door finally opened, and Bethany stepped in, her face a mixture of irritation and boredom. "What now?" she asked, her voice clipped, arms crossed as she looked at Aaliyah with a faint sneer. Aaliyah swallowed, her face warming as she struggled to speak. I need to go to the bathroom," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Could you help me into the wheelchair?" Bethany let out an exaggerated sigh but moved the wheelchair closer, her actions devoid of care as she helped Aaliyah maneuver herself painfully from the bed. Once she was settled, Bethany rolled her out of the room, her pace so brisk and unsteady that Aaliyah had to grip the chair's arms to keep herself from jolting with each push. They passed through the dark, empty hallways, the shadows pooling in the corners making the hospital feel desolate and unnerving. But then Bethany stopped abruptly in an unfamiliar corridor, her expression cold as she looked down at Aaliyah. "Wait here," she said flatly, as if giving an order. Aaliyah's brow furrowed. "Aren't you taking me to the bathroom?" Bethany's expression was dismissive, her gaze like ice. "I have other things to do," she replied, her tone leaving no room for argument. With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Aaliyah alone in the dimly lit hallway. Aaliyah sat in stunned silence, watching Bethany disappear down the corridor. Shadows seemed to close in around her, pressing from all sides, amplifying her sense of isolation. The quiet of the hallway was thick and oppressive, interrupted only by the distant hum of machinery. She tried to steady her breathing, her hands gripping the wheelchair's armrests as her heart pounded. Each minute felt like an eternity, her discomfort growing as the moments dragged on. The sense of abandonment weighed heavily on her, a deep-seated dread sinking in. She had called for help, only to be met with indifference, her needs deemed unimportant. Aaliyah's grip tightened on the armrests as she sat, alone and vulnerable, a growing sense of determination flickering within her despite the pain. The minutes felt endless as Aaliyah sat alone in the shadowed hallway, her discomfort growing with each passing second. The sharp ache in her bladder became a constant reminder of her helplessness, and her muscles stiffened from the awkward position in the wheelchair. She strained her ears for any sign of movement, a hint that someone might come by and help, but the hallway was swallowed by an oppressive quiet that magnified her isolation. After a while, faint footsteps echoed in the distance, growing louder until two hospital staff members appeared at the far end of the hallway. The glint of their badges and the casual ease in their stride told her they were employees, likely on their way to another part of the hospital. A surge of relief filled her, and she almost called out for assistance, but something in their tone stopped her. They were talking, unfiltered, in a way that suggested they didn't expect anyone else to be around. Another complaint from the woman in room 6, one of them muttered, her voice filled with annoyance. "Some patients just think they're entitled to special treatment, don't they?" The other nurse, a young man with a casual tone, chuckled softly. "It's always the same types, you know? They come in, make demands, and act like we owe them something." Aaliyah's chest tightened. Her mind raced, recognizing the unspoken meaning behind their words, each one stinging like a fresh wound. She knew that tone, the implication that her needs were somehow a nuisance, that her mere presence here made her a burden. Just yesterday, the woman continued, her tone dripping with disdain, another one was whining about her medication. "It's like they think they're special, that they should get priority." A wave of humiliation washed over Aliyah. Her mind replayed each moment she had asked for help, every instance that had been met with Bethany's impatience. She remembered how Bethany had rolled her eyes, how her requests for small adjustments had been met with cold indifference. Now, hearing these other staff members speak, Aliyah realized it wasn't just Bethany. There was something larger, a thread of resentment woven into the fabric of the hospital's culture. People just don't understand how hard it is for us, the young man added. They're constantly making demands, and we're stretched thin as it is. They're lucky to be here at all. Their voices faded as they walked further down the hallway, leaving Aliyah to process the weight of their words. Her pulse quickened, a mixture of anger and shame pooling in her chest. They spoke of her, and patients like her, as if they were less deserving of care, as if their needs were an inconvenience rather than a responsibility. She sat in silence, her breath shallow, feeling as though the walls were closing in around her. For a long moment, she felt stripped of her dignity, reduced to nothing more than a stereotype in their eyes. The resentment they carried toward patients like her wasn't just unkind, it was something darker, something that went beyond individual resentment and seemed to seep through the hospital itself. Just as she steeled herself, determined not to let their words break her, more footsteps echoed down the hallway. This time, 2 more staff members rounded the corner, their voices low and conspiratorial. "Did you hear about that patient in room 112? One of them whispered, the words tinged with an almost amused tone. "Another one of them causing trouble." "Oh, I know the type," her companion replied with a sneer. "They always come in with that attitude, like we're supposed to drop everything just for them." Aliyah's hands clenched around the armrests, her nails digging into the worn fabric. Each word struck her with a fresh sting, each one underscoring the prejudice that seemed to pervade this place. Their casual remarks cut deeper than she expected, especially the way they said them, with a disdain that was unmistakable. "They think everything's about them," the woman continued, her voice dropping to a harsh laugh. "And don't even get me started on the racism card. That's always the go-to when they don't get their way." Aliyah's jaw tightened, the shame morphing into anger. They weren't just making offhanded remarks. They were mocking patients who might be experiencing real pain, real fear. And worse, they were dismissing any acknowledgement of racism as an excuse. It was as though the patients' identities, their humanity, were inconveniences that could be minimized, brushed aside as entitlement. The young man's response was equally chilling. "I know, right? And half the time, they don't even have insurance. They should be grateful they're here at all." Aliyah's heart pounded, her mind racing through each of their comments, each word deepening her sense of betrayal and anger. They were supposed to be the people she could rely on, the people who would care for her while she was at her most vulnerable. Instead, they saw her as an obstacle, a burden to be endured. As their voices faded down the hallway, Aliyah sat in the thick silence that followed, her mind swirling with a mixture of shame, anger, and determination. For the first time since her admission, she felt her helplessness transform into something else, a small but resolute spark of defiance. She would remember this. She would remember every dismissive laugh, every cold remark. This wasn't just about her, it was about all the others who had likely experienced this same treatment, left to feel unseen and unvalued in a place that should have been a sanctuary. The reality was chilling, but it also fueled her determination. This wasn't just neglect, it was a pattern, something deeper and far more ingrained than she had realized. Her mind flashed back to Bethany's disdainful expression, the way she had spoken as if Aliyah's pain was an inconvenience. The memory stirred a quiet but undeniable resolve within her. She might have felt powerless in that darkened hallway, but now, with every whisper and every laugh that had echoed around her, she found a newfound sense of purpose. This couldn't go on, not for her or for anyone else. She knew that she couldn't be silent, not if there was any chance that her voice could bring change. She would remember each detail, each cruel remark, and every moment of neglect, letting it build her resolve. As the early morning light began to filter through the distant windows, casting long shadows across the floor, Aliyah took a deep breath. She was exhausted, her body aching from the hours of discomfort, but her spirit was fortified in a way she hadn't anticipated. Her anger had transformed into a strength she hadn't felt before. Whatever came next, she knew that she couldn't back down. She wouldn't let herself be reduced to a stereotype, wouldn't let herself be silenced or dismissed. She would speak, if not for herself, then for all the others who might not have the strength to stand up to this quiet cruelty. The shadows of the hallway no longer felt oppressive, they felt like witnesses to a moment of clarity. And with that, Aaliyah waited, her eyes focused ahead, her resolve crystallizing. She would find her voice, and she would make sure that this, all of it, would not be forgotten. Aaliyah lay back in her hospital bed, her thoughts still haunted by the event of the night. Each cruel word she'd overheard from the staff echoed in her mind, solidifying her resolve to expose the indifference that pervaded this place. She had come here vulnerable, hoping to be treated with compassion and care, but what she found was something much darker, something deeply rooted in prejudice. As the morning sun began to filter through the blinds, she turned to her phone on the tray beside her bed. It felt like a lifeline, a bridge to the world beyond the hospital's cold walls. Her fingers hovered over the screen, hesitating. She wasn't sure what she would say, or even whom to reach out to. All she knew was that the silence she'd endured that night could not continue. Just as she was about to pick up the phone, the door opened, and a young nurse named Janice stepped in. Aaliyah remembered her from earlier shifts, a soft-spoken trainee who was always quick and efficient, but distant. This time, however, Janice's gaze lingered on Aaliyah, her brow furrowing with concern. "How are you doing, Miss Johnson?" Janice asked gently, her tone free from the detachment that had become so familiar to Aaliyah. There was no trace of Bethany's coldness in her voice. Aaliyah hesitated, uncertain of how much to reveal. She studied Janice's expression, looking for any sign that this nurse might see her as the others did. But Janice's eyes held only genuine concern, a glimmer of empathy that felt like a lifeline. I had a difficult night," Aaliyah admitted quietly, her voice thick with exhaustion. Janice nodded, her expression softening further. She glanced toward the door, ensuring they were alone, before lowering her voice. "I heard that Nurse Hensley was overseeing your care last night." The careful tone in her voice suggested she was aware of Bethany's reputation. A surge of validation washed over Aaliyah. This small, almost tentative comment felt like a bridge, a signal that Janice might understand. She took a shaky breath, deciding to trust her. "Yes. And I overheard things," Aaliyah whispered, a mixture of anger and sadness weighing down her words. "Things that made me feel like it's not just me. It's how they see all of us." Janice's face tightened, her gaze shifting momentarily to the floor. "I wish I could say it's not true," she said, her voice almost too quiet to hear. She looked around again, then leaned in closer. "This place has issues. People don't always see patients the way they should, especially," she trailed off, but Aaliyah knew exactly what she meant. For the first time, Aaliyah felt the weight of her anger shared, as if she were no longer alone in carrying it. Her heart beat a little faster, the final pieces of her resolve locking into place. "People need to know," she said, her voice steadying. "They need to know what happens when no one's looking, how patients are made to feel less than human." Janice's expression flickered between empathy and fear, a clear understanding of the risks that speaking out would carry. "Miss Johnson, I know you're right, but this place," she shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. "If you go public, they'll do everything they can to protect themselves. They're good at that." Aaliyah met her gaze, feeling her own fear soften under the strength of her convictions. "I'm not scared of them," she replied firmly, though her heart raced. "I've been through worse, and if I don't say something, this will just keep happening to others who might not be able to speak for themselves." Janice nodded slowly, giving her a faint smile, one that carried both encouragement and caution. "Just, please be careful," she whispered. She finished adjusting Aaliyah's fur and straightened, casting one last look over her shoulder before leaving the room, the quiet encouragement of her expression lingering like a gentle nudge forward. With Janice gone, Aaliyah turned back to her phone. She scrolled through her contacts, her finger stopping over the name of an old friend. Someone she trusted. Someone who had stood by her through the struggles of her life and would know how to help her navigate this new challenge. Her heart pounded as she tapped the name, feeling a swell of fear and anticipation. The phone rang only twice before her friend picked up. "Aliyah, is everything all right?" The concern in her friend's voice was instant, wrapping around her like a balm. Taking a deep breath, Aliyah began to speak. Her voice shook at first, hesitant and thick with emotion. But as she recounted each detail of her experience, the words flowed with increasing steadiness. She described the cold hostility in Bethany's voice, the dismissive comments she'd overheard, and the humiliation she felt when the staff spoke about her and other patients like her with such disdain. Her friend listened intently, interjecting with soft reassurances as Aliyah poured out her pain and anger. Each word felt like a release, a reclaiming of her dignity that had been chipped away over the dark hours of the night. By the time she finished, her voice was steady, a newfound determination filling her heart. "This can't stay hidden, Aliyah," her friend said, her voice filled with conviction. "People need to know. What happened to you is unacceptable, and the world needs to see it. I'll help you get the story out." A surge of gratitude mixed with relief washed over Aliyah. She hadn't realized how much strength she could find in someone else's belief in her story. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for believing me. I don't want anyone else to go through this." "You won't be alone in this," her friend promised, her words filled with warmth and a fierce loyalty. "We'll make sure the truth is heard." They spoke a little longer, discussing the next steps. Her friend would reach out to contacts in local media, share Aliyah's story anonymously if need be, and begin the work of bringing her experience to light. When Aliyah finally hung up, a weight had lifted from her chest, replaced by a sense of empowerment she hadn't felt in years. Whatever happened next, she was prepared. The day of her discharge arrived sooner than she expected. She felt a strange mix of relief and trepidation as she prepared to leave, the sterile walls of the hospital seeming almost oppressive now that she knew she was free. The sunlight outside was warm, the fresh air a welcome contrast to the stifling atmosphere she'd endured. But as she stepped out, she knew that her battle was only beginning. Her story was in her friend's hands now, but the uncertainty still lingered. Would people believe her? Would her voice make the impact she hoped it would? The answer came sooner than she'd imagined. Just a few days later, her phone buzzed with a notification. She opened it, her heart racing as she saw the headline, "Racism in Healthcare, Patient Speaks Out on Harrowing Treatment." The article laid out her story in stark detail, sparing none of the cold hostility she'd endured, recounting every dismissive comment, every hour she'd spent alone in that dark hallway. As she scrolled through the article, her hands trembled. She had put everything on the line to share this truth, and now it was out there for the world to see. The response was immediate, an overwhelming flood of reactions pouring in. People were shocked, outraged. Comments ranged from disbelief to calls for accountability, demanding answers from the hospital. And then, as if her courage had broken a dam, others began to come forward. Patients who had experienced similar treatment, people who had felt dismissed or dehumanized, started sharing their own stories. They spoke of coldness, neglect, and prejudice in the healthcare system, each new story amplifying the call for change. Hashtags like #JusticeForAliyah and #EndMedicalRacism began trending, the public's voice joining hers in a chorus of support and outrage. For the first time, Aliyah felt the weight of her silence lifted. Her voice had sparked something real, a force that could no longer be ignored. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages of support, each one a reminder that she wasn't alone in this fight. She had taken a stand, and people were listening. As the day stretched on, Aliyah allowed herself a small, quiet smile, feeling a sense of relief she had never known. She had faced her fears, spoken her truth, and the world was finally listening. The media response to Aliyah's story had grown beyond anything she had anticipated. As her story spread across news outlets and social media, public outrage mounted. Messages of support poured in from strangers, friends, and other patients who had faced similar indignities, each one carrying a ripple of hope and validation. But the story had also ignited backlash. Some dismissed her experience, calling it exaggerated or overly sensitive. Others suggested she was just seeking attention, unwilling to believe her account of prejudice in a place meant for healing. Amidst this storm of reactions, Aaliyah received an unexpected email. Denise Ford, a well-known civil rights attorney, reached out, offering her support. Denise was respected in the community for championing cases that confronted discrimination, and her email was both brief and encouraging. She wanted to meet, convinced that Aaliyah had grounds to sue the hospital for its discriminatory practices. The idea of a lawsuit hadn't been part of Aaliyah's plan. She had thought only of exposing the truth, but as she read Denise's email, a surge of purpose filled her. This was a chance to hold the hospital accountable, not just for herself but for all the patients who might have suffered in silence. The possibility of real, lasting change flickered in her mind, and she decided to move forward. A few days later, Aaliyah found herself in Denise's office, the room warm and inviting, with bookshelves stacked with legal texts and framed photos of Denise with past clients. As Denise listened to Aaliyah recount each painful detail, her eyes were filled with empathy, but also a fierce determination. "We have a strong case," Denise said, her tone resolute once Aaliyah had finished. "What you endured wasn't just negligence, it was discrimination. By suing, you'll force the hospital to confront its culture, and you'll set an example that institutions cannot treat patients this way." Aaliyah nodded, her decision solidifying with every word Denise spoke. "I want to make sure this never happens to anyone else," she replied, her voice steady. "If they won't listen to our voices, maybe they'll listen when it hits their bottom line." As Denise prepared to file the lawsuit, more former patients came forward, willing to testify to similar mistreatment by the hospital staff, including Nurse Bethany. Each story painted a grim picture of a hospital where some patients were treated as burdens rather than individuals deserving of care. Months passed as Denise gathered evidence, preparing meticulously for what would be a challenging case. Throughout the process, Denise reassured Aaliyah, promising her that they would prove a pattern of negligence and prejudice that the hospital could not deny. The day of the trial arrived, the courtroom packed with reporters, supporters, and former patients who hoped to witness a moment of justice. Aaliyah sat beside Denise, her hands trembling slightly as she glanced at the packed rows of observers. Across the aisle, she spotted Bethany, her face a mask of composure, her back straight and her eyes filled with cold determination. Aaliyah held her gaze briefly, then looked away, reminded of the night she had spent haunted by that same icy stare. Denise rose to deliver her opening statement, her voice calm and filled with conviction. She described Aaliyah's experience with detail and clarity, recounting the negligence and outright hostility she had endured under Bethany's care. Denise made it clear that this case was not an isolated incident but rather a symptom of a broader issue within the hospital, a culture that allowed certain patients to be dismissed as burdens rather than individuals in need of empathy and care. The hospital's defense lawyer countered, painting Aaliyah as a difficult patient who had misinterpreted ordinary healthcare challenges as hostility. He insisted that Bethany had been doing her job and that Aaliyah had taken routine frustrations personally, blowing a minor incident out of proportion. His tone was dismissive, casting Aaliyah as overly sensitive. But Denise was undeterred. She began to call witnesses to the stand, each one strengthening Aaliyah's case. The first was a former patient who described her own experience with Bethany, how she'd been treated with a similar coldness and impatience, her requests ignored or met with irritation. She recalled how Bethany's dismissive tone had made her feel small and insignificant, reduced to nothing more than a bothersome duty. The defense lawyer tried to discredit her, suggesting she had misread Bethany's tone, but Denise expertly redirected, drawing out specific details in her testimony that mirrored Aaliyah's experience. The jury listened intently, the threads of similarity weaving together a picture of a pattern that couldn't be ignored. Then, it was Aaliyah's turn to take the stand. Her heart pounded as she spoke, but she kept her voice steady, determined to make every word count. She recounted the events in excruciating detail, the long, isolated hours in the dark hallway, the dismissive and hostile comments, and the threatening words that Bethany had used to silence her. The courtroom was silent, every word carrying the weight of her pain and resilience. Bethany's lawyer cross-examined her, his questions laced with skepticism. He suggested that her pain and vulnerability might have made her more sensitive than usual, implying that she was projecting her frustrations onto Bethany, who was only doing her best under challenging conditions. But Aliyah held her ground, repeating the dismissive words she had overheard, the cruel tone that had made it impossible to mistake Bethany's intentions. She made it clear that this was no projection, it was a lived experience, one she wouldn't wish on anyone. The following day, Bethany took the stand. She spoke in a calm, almost contrived voice, portraying herself as a dedicated nurse under tremendous pressure. Her words were carefully chosen, her tone filled with strange sincerity as she insisted that Aliyah's accusations were deeply hurtful to her. "I care deeply about all my patients," Bethany said, her voice soft but controlled. "This accusation is based on misunderstandings, and it hurts to be portrayed in such a negative light." Her lawyer guided her skillfully, framing her as a hard-working professional misunderstood by a difficult patient. Bethany emphasized how overworked she had been, how challenging her job was, and how patients sometimes failed to appreciate the effort she made for them. She presented herself as a victim, someone unfairly blamed for routine healthcare stresses. When Denise cross-examined her, however, Bethany's facade began to crack. Denise pressed her on specific remarks, asking her directly if she had said to Aliyah, "Respect is earned, Miss Johnson." Bethany hesitated, her face tightening as she tried to explain it away. "I only meant that sometimes patients expect too much," she answered, her tone slipping into a colder edge. Denise caught this shift and pressed harder, highlighting Bethany's behavior as reported by other patients. Bit by bit, Bethany grew defensive, attempting to deflect responsibility, but each answer revealed more of the underlying hostility she had shown to patients like Aliyah. More witnesses took the stand in the days that followed, former patients who recounted stories of cold, dismissive treatment from Bethany and other staff members. Each story added to the mounting evidence, painting a picture of a hospital that harbored subtle but undeniable prejudices, especially toward minority patients. Denise presented performance reviews noting Bethany's lack of sensitivity toward certain patients, showing that this wasn't the first time her behavior had been questioned. The defense lawyer fought back, accusing each witness of holding grudges or overreacting to routine frustrations in healthcare. But the more he tried to discredit these accounts, the more the pattern of mistreatment became clear to the jury. It was no longer one patient's word against Bethany's, it was a chorus of voices, each one echoing the same painful truth. Finally, on the last day of the trial, Denise stood to give her closing argument. Her voice was steady, impassioned as she spoke of Aliyah's courage and the systemic issue that went beyond just one nurse. "What happened to Miss Johnson is a reflection of something much deeper," Denise said, turning to the jury. "She was treated as less than, her humanity ignored, her needs dismissed, all because of prejudice that has no place in healthcare. This trial is not only about what happened to Miss Johnson. It's about every patient who has walked into that hospital and been treated as a burden instead of a person. We ask that you deliver justice, not just for Aliyah, but for all those who have suffered in silence." The defense lawyer gave his own closing statement, insisting once more that the accusations were misunderstandings and that Bethany had been unfairly targeted. But his words felt hollow against the weight of the testimony that had filled the courtroom. After hours of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict in Aliyah's favor. The court ordered the hospital to pay significant damages for the emotional distress and neglect she had endured. More importantly, the court mandated a full internal review of the hospital's practices, including training on sensitivity and non-discrimination. Bethany's license was placed under review, with disciplinary action to follow. Aliyah walked out of the courthouse with Denise by her side, feeling a mixture of relief and empowerment. She had not only won justice for herself, but had taken a stand for those who might never have been heard otherwise. The weight she had carried for so long had been lifted, replaced by the knowledge that her voice had made a difference. In the weeks following the trial, Aliyah's life took on a surreal quality. News of her victory spread quickly, and her case became a symbol for the fight against discrimination in healthcare. Messages of support continued to pour in, not just from people she knew, but from strangers across the country. Many shared their own experiences, stories of neglect and mistreatment that echoed what she had endured. Aliyah realized that her voice had not only been heard but had sparked something far-reaching, something she had never dared to imagine. At home, she tried to settle back into normal life, but the reality of what she had accomplished often left her feeling both uplifted and overwhelmed. There were moments when she would sit by her window, gazing out at the city as it moved around her, feeling as if she were somehow detached from it all. She was the same person, yet profoundly changed. She'd fought an institution armed with only her truth, and had forced them to confront their own darkness. She had faced her worst fears and had come out stronger, not just for herself but for those who had felt voiceless. The hospital was under intense scrutiny now. Sweeping reforms were introduced, policies changed, and training programs were implemented to address biases and ensure that patients of all backgrounds were treated with the respect they deserved. Hospital administrators faced pressure to demonstrate accountability, and every action was watched closely by a public that refused to forget what Aaliyah had exposed. Even Nurse Bethany, who had once seemed untouchable, was not immune. Her license remained under review, and her reputation, once protected by the walls of the hospital, was now tarnished. Bethany's public response had been defiant, with her insisting she had been misunderstood, but the court's decision spoke louder than her protests. People had seen her for who she truly was, and there was no going back. In one of her quiet moments, Aaliyah found herself reflecting on the night she'd spent alone in that dark hallway. The fear, the shame, the cold isolation, it was a memory that would stay with her forever, a scar that would always linger in some part of her heart. But instead of feeling haunted by it, she now felt a strange sense of peace. That night had broken something in her, but it had also given her the strength to rebuild herself, stronger and more resilient. Her thoughts often drifted to the messages she continued to receive. Some were stories of support, but others were messages from patients who had felt invisible, disregarded, left to endure the same silence she had once faced. Each message reminded her of the weight of what she'd done, the responsibility of carrying a story that had resonated with so many. She read each one carefully, feeling a connection to each person who had shared their pain with her. Among these messages was one from a mother whose daughter had been a patient at the same hospital. "Thank you," the woman had written, "for giving a voice to those who have none. My daughter went through something similar, and your courage has given us the strength to fight back." Aaliyah read the message several times, her heart swelling with gratitude and resolve. She had never imagined herself as a symbol of resilience, but knowing that her fight had inspired others made every painful memory worth it. Denise, her attorney, continued to check in with her, offering support and keeping her informed about the ongoing changes at the hospital. "The fight for justice doesn't end with one victory," Denise had told her during a phone call. "This was a start, Aaliyah, but your voice will keep pushing them forward. And if they backslide, we'll be there to hold them accountable." Her words reassured Aaliyah, giving her a sense of purpose. She realized that her journey was about more than just her experience, it was about paving the way for change in a system that had ignored too many for too long. The hospital's reforms might take time, and the change might not be immediate, but Aaliyah's lawsuit had set a precedent. Policies were being reviewed, and staff were being trained to address their biases. And while it was only a beginning, she felt proud to know she had helped create it. One evening, Aaliyah was watching the news when a segment aired covering the hospital's new initiatives. They showed scenes of staff undergoing sensitivity training, discussions about non-discriminatory practices, and interviews with administrators who spoke of their commitment to reform. It felt strange to see her story reflected back in this way, transformed from an experience of pain into a catalyst for progress. The news anchor mentioned her by name, calling her an advocate for justice and a courageous voice for change. As Aaliyah listened, a small smile crept across her face. She had never imagined that her actions would have such a wide-reaching impact. Her journey, born from isolation and fear, had now rippled outward, affecting countless lives and challenging a broken system to do better. The weeks passed, and Aaliyah began to reclaim parts of herself that had felt lost. She started reconnecting with friends, spending time outdoors, and focusing on her own well-being. But there was a new strength within her, a self-assuredness that hadn't been there before. The old doubts that had once clouded her mind, the fear of speaking up, the anxiety of not being believed, had faded, replaced by a quiet confidence that she carried with her in everything she did. She received invitations to speak at local advocacy events, and although public speaking had never been her strength, she accepted. Standing in front of a crowd, she would recount her story, her voice steady and sure as she spoke of her journey and the importance of standing up for what was right. Each time, she saw faces light up with recognition, as if they were hearing their own stories echoed in hers. And each time, she felt a surge of pride, knowing that her story was making a difference. In her quiet moments, she would sit by her window, watching the sun dip below the horizon, feeling the warmth of her own hard-won peace. She had faced an institution that had tried to silence her, to strip her of her dignity, and she had emerged victorious. Her scars were reminders of that journey, but they no longer felt like burdens. Instead, they were marks of her strength, symbols of her resilience. One night, as she looked out at the city lights flickering in the distance, Aliyah closed her eyes and breathed deeply, feeling a sense of calm that filled her entirely. She had taken on a system and won, not only for herself but for every person who had ever felt unseen, unheard, and disregarded. Her story had sparked change, and she knew it would continue to inspire others. And as she sat there, bathed in the gentle glow of twilight, she felt ready for whatever lay ahead. The fight for justice and equality was far from over, but she was no longer afraid. She had found her voice, a voice that had been silenced for too long, and she knew that it would carry forward, making a difference not just for herself, but for countless others. In that quiet, peaceful moment, Aliyah knew she had truly reclaimed her life. Whatever came next, she was ready to face it head-on, knowing that her strength was a force that could not be broken.